Imagine hearing your own voice demanding a ransom for your niece's kidnapping. The police believe the recording, your parents disown you, and your sister is weeping in grief, even though you know she's the one who gave that child those horrific bruises. This is a story of how my own flesh and blood turned my life into a living hell with a single video, and how her own greed eventually sent her behind bars. You monster! Tell them where you hid her. My sister, Natalie, shrieked, collapsing into our father's arms as the tactical team dragged me out in handcuffs. She kidnapped my baby. I didn't struggle. I just stared at her, because exactly 24 hours ago, she wasn't screaming. She was begging me to hide her daughter to mask the marks she'd left behind. She thought she could frame the family scapegoat for her own crime. She was wrong. This is how I dismantled her perfect lie. It began exactly 24 hours before the sirens reached my driveway. My cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where my family's chaos couldn't find me. I had bought it with the royalties from my last novel, paid for in cash and the promise of solitude. The only sounds were the wind through the hemlocks and the steady scratch of my pen on paper. Then my phone buzzed. Natalie's name flashed on the screen, and my stomach tightened with that familiar, conditioned dread. I almost didn't answer. I should have let it go to voicemail, but the conditioning runs deep. Sarah, thank God! Natalie screamed the moment I picked up. Her voice was at a frequency of pure panic that I had heard 1,000 times before. It's James. He collapsed. They think it's his heart. I'm following the ambulance to the hospital now. I can't have Sophie see him like this. You have to take her. Please, you're the only one I trust. The logic was full of holes. James was 34 and a marathon runner. They had a full staff at the house, nannies, a driver, a housekeeper. Why drive 3 hours into the mountains to drop a child off with a sister you barely spoke to? But panic is a contagious disease, and Natalie was patient zero. I told her yes. I always said yes. 2 hours later, a black SUV tore up my gravel drive. Natalie jumped out, looking less like a grieving wife and more like a woman fleeing a crime scene. She was perfectly made up, her designer dress spotless, but her eyes were wild. She pulled my 8-year-old niece, Sophie, from the back seat. Sophie didn't look at me, she just stared at her shoes. It was mid-July, 90 degrees with a humidity that clung to the skin like plastic wrap. Yet Sophie was wearing a thick, long-sleeved hoodie pulled tight around her face. When I reached out to take her hand, she flinched, a small, violent jerk of her shoulder as if she expected a blow. I saw a dark smudge on her wrist, just peeking out from the sleeve. A bruise. Not a playground scrape, but the deep, sickly purple of finger marks. I should have asked right then. I should have demanded to see her arms. I should have called James myself. But I didn't. And you have to understand why. It wasn't because I was stupid. It was because I was trapped in the normalization of cruelty. For 28 years, I had been the janitor of Natalie's life. When she wrecked her car in college, I took the blame to save her insurance rates. When she stole money from our parents, I replaced it from my own savings so she wouldn't get caught. I had been systematically trained to view her chaos as my responsibility. We call it being a good sister, but it's actually a survival mechanism. If I fixed the problem, the screaming stopped. If I asked questions, the screaming got worse. I looked at the bruise and my brain instantly rewrote the reality. She fell. She's clumsy. Natalie is just stressed, don't make it worse. I was so desperate to keep the peace that I ignored the war being waged on a child's body. I viewed Sophie not as a victim, but as another mess I had to quietly clean up so the family show could go on. I was the designated fixer, and fixers don't ask why the floor is bloody, they just bleach it. So, I took Sophie's hand gently. I let the lies slide down my throat like broken glass. "Thank you. You're a lifesaver," Natalie said, already backing toward the driver's seat. "I'll call you when we know more. Don't let her have sugar, and don't let her use the phone because she's in shock." She sped off before the dust could even settle, leaving me standing in the heavy mountain silence with a trembling child and a feeling in my gut that was colder than a winter frost. I took Sophie inside, made her hot chocolate despite the heat, and locked the door. I thought I was keeping the world out. I didn't realize I had just locked myself inside the frame-up. Sophie slept fitfully on the couch, whimpering in her dreams. I stayed up all night watching her, my phone on the coffee table like a dormant grenade. When the sun finally bled through the pines, I tried to call Natalie again. Straight to voicemail. I called James. Straight to voicemail. I made pancakes, trying to create a sense of normalcy in the suffocating quiet of the cabin. Sophie sat at the table, staring at her plate, her small frame still hunched in that heavy sweatshirt. She hadn't spoken a word since she arrived. Every time I moved too quickly, she flinched. Then my phone lit up, but it wasn't Natalie calling to check on her traumatized child. It was a text from my mother, Martha. "We always knew you were jealous, Sarah, but this? You're a monster." I stared at the screen, the words blurring into a jagged mess. Before I could even begin to process the accusation, another one flashed through, this time from my father. "Give her back. Don't make this worse than it already is. You are dead to us." I felt the room tilt. They weren't asking if Sophie was safe. They weren't asking what happened or where we were. They had skipped straight to the verdict. It was a whisper campaign that had turned into a roar before I even knew I was on trial. For 30 years, Natalie had been the sun and I had been the shadow. If Natalie told them I was a monster, then in their eyes, I grew claws and fangs. They didn't need proof, they just needed her word. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. I have to call them, I thought. I have to explain. That was when the windows rattled. It wasn't the wind, but the heavy thud of vehicles on gravel. Blue and red lights washed over the cabin walls, turning my sanctuary into a crime scene. The next few minutes were a blur of violence and noise. The door crashing inward, the bark of orders, the bite of cold metal around my wrists. But the moment that actually broke me wasn't the physical force. It was what happened when the lead detective, a man with eyes like flint, pulled out his phone and pressed play. A voice filled the room. My voice. "I have your daughter. If you want to see her alive again, wire $500,000 to the offshore account I sent. If you go to the police, I'll finish what I started. Don't test me, Natalie." The cadence, the pitch, that slight rasp I get when I'm exhausted, it was perfect. It was undeniable. It was me. But I had never said those words. I looked at the detective and opened my mouth to scream, to deny it, to fight. But nothing came out. Throat closed up. My body went limp. I didn't struggle as they hauled me up. I didn't thrash. I went silent. People think that when you're innocent, you fight like a lion. They think you scream your truth until the walls shake. But that isn't what happens when you're the family scapegoat. When you've spent a lifetime being told that your reality is wrong, that your feelings are invalid, and that you are the problem, your brain is wired differently. It's the invisible chains of the survivor. When the collective finger of authority, my parents, my sister, the law, pointed at me and said, "You are the villain," a broken part of my brain simply accepted it. Not because I was guilty, but because it felt inevitable. Of course I was the villain. I was always the villain. The gaslighting had been so thorough, so decades long, that for a split second, looking at that detective, I actually wondered if I had done it and just forgotten. That is the true power of abuse. It doesn't just hurt you, it makes you doubt your own existence. I let them drag me out past my screaming sister. I let them shove me into the back of the cruiser. I sat in the dark, wrapped in the cold comfort of the inevitable, while the real monster stood weeping on my lawn, playing the role of a lifetime. The interrogation room was a sterile box of grey walls and buzzing fluorescent lights. It smelled of stale coffee and fear. Detective Reynolds sat across from me, laying out photographs on the metal table like a grotesque tarot reading. Photo 1. A neighbor's grainy cell phone picture of me helping Sophie out of the SUV. "Witnesses say you dragged the girl," Reynolds said, his voice flat. "That doesn't look like a hug to me, Sarah." Photo 2. A close-up of Sophie's arm, mottled with those purple and yellow bruises. "The mother claims you inflicted these. Said you have a history of aggression when you don't get your way." Photo 3. A transcript of the recorded call. $500,000. That's a lot of money for a novelist. What were you planning to buy? Or were you just tired of living in her shadow? He leaned forward, the chair legs scraping against the linoleum. "We're looking at aggravated kidnapping, extortion, and child abuse. In this state, that's a life sentence. No parole. You die in a cage, Sarah. Unless you tell me where the money was supposed to go." The words "a life sentence" hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in 24 hours, the fog in my brain cleared. The paralysis of the scapegoat shattered under the weight of the accusation. This wasn't just my family being cruel. This wasn't just Natalie needing to be the center of attention. This was a calculated, architectural dismantling of my life. I looked at the photos again. The neighbors saw what they expected to see, a struggle. The bruises were real, but the timeline was a lie. And the money, $500,000, was the exact amount of debt Natalie had racked up in high-stakes online poker the previous year. I knew because she'd begged me for $10,000 to cover the interest, and like a fool, I'd given it to her. She wasn't just framing me, she was using me to extort her own husband. She had likely told James that I took the girl, demanded the ransom from him, and planned to pocket the cash while I rotted in a cell. It was brilliant. It was evil. It was vintage Natalie. I sat up straighter, the cold metal of the table biting into my forearms. "I want a lawyer," I said, my voice raspy but steady. "And I want you to check the metadata on that recording. It's a deepfake." Reynolds smirked. "Sure. But right now, your sister is sobbing in the lobby. Your parents are giving statements about your history of unstable behavior. And your niece is too terrified to speak. You're alone, Sarah." He was wrong. I wasn't alone. I was just the only one in the room who knew the truth. Meanwhile, in the observation room next door, another drama was unfolding. I didn't know it then, but the secondary twist of my nightmare was sitting in a plastic chair, sweating through his expensive gym shirt. Jake, Natalie's personal trainer, the man she'd been seeing behind James's back for 6 months. Natalie had promised him $50,000 if he helped her scare James into paying the ransom. All he had to do was drive the getaway car if things went south. When the tactical team arrived, Natalie hadn't protected him. As she screamed on the lawn, she had leaned into a rookie officer and whispered, "He made me do it. That man, Jake. His Sarah's boyfriend. They planned it together." Jake had been brought in as an accomplice. He was sitting there, listening to the officers discuss his impending charges, conspiracy to kidnap. He realized with dawning horror that he wasn't her partner. He was a loose end she was cutting. Jake wasn't about to go to prison for a woman who would throw him under the bus to save her manicure. He demanded to speak to the investigators, insisting he had leverage. He hadn't just driven the car. He had recorded everything. On his phone was a video that would shatter Natalie's carefully crafted victim narrative. I was led not to a cell, but into an observation room filled with staged grief. My mother was sobbing into a tissue. My father was seething with quiet rage. James played the part of the broken father, and at the center of it all sat Natalie, fragile, trembling, a masterclass in performative trauma. The moment she saw me, the act flipped. She screamed accusations, lunging forward as if to strike me, painting me once more as the family monster. Before I could speak, Detective Reynolds placed a laptop on the table. "We've received new evidence," he said quietly. "From an accomplice. Jake, it turned out, hadn't accused me. He had eviscerated Natalie." The video played, shot from a hidden angle inside Natalie's SUV. It showed her carefully doctoring Sophie's bruises with theatrical makeup, darkening the marks and instructing the girl to cry and rehearse her accusations so James would pay. Sophie's small voice complied, thin and reedy with fear. The room went dead silent. James stared at his wife in pure horror. Natalie panicked, her voice rising to a screech, claiming the footage was a sophisticated deepfake. Reynolds shut that down instantly with timestamps and digital verification. Then the door opened, and Sophie walked in. Natalie tried to summon her with practiced sweetness, her arms outstretched. Instead, Sophie ran straight to me, clinging to my waist and whispering that her mother had threatened to hurt her for real if she didn't lie. The illusion collapsed. James reached out and snatched Natalie's phone from her hand. Trapped, she finally screamed the truth. She had done it for the money. Reynolds arrested her on the spot. Our parents said nothing. For the first time in their lives, they saw the story they had believed for decades crumble into dust. Natalie was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in a state facility. James filed for divorce before the ink on her indictment was dry. In a move that reflected his own guilt and the realization of the bond one shared with his daughter, he signed over full custody of Sophie to me, providing a substantial financial settlement as both an apology and a means to secure her future. My parents tried to bridge the gap, of course. They sent tearful letters and made frantic calls, offering hollow excuses about how they were a misled heir and a manipulated. I didn't give them an inch. Instead, I secured a permanent no-contact order. Some bridges are better left burned to ashes. You don't get to spend 30 years building a cage and then ask for the key once the occupant escapes. A year has passed, and I still live in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. With the settlement, I founded a sanctuary, an art therapy center for children who have survived the subtle, crushing weight of narcissistic abuse. Sophie is 9 now. She is vibrant, she is loud, and most importantly, she is no longer afraid. Justice wasn't just the sound of a cell door locking. Justice was the life we built once the monsters were gone. For every person who has been made the villain in someone else's twisted story, know this: you aren't the problem. You were always the solution.